If one were to take only a cursory glance at the seaplane, it would not be unfair to see a hangover from a bygone era, of the terrestrial world clinging desperately to the coattails of the new, open expanse of the sky which had come to replace the wonder of the high seas. Certainly, the conception for a flying machine wedded to a boat can find its roots long before the advent of the aeroplane. As far back as 1670, the Jesuit father Francesco di Lana Terzi dreamt of an aerial ship which took off and landed upon the water. It was an ingenious concept that at the time had no science with which to either make it a reality nor disprove its veracity, yet within just under 8 years of the Wright brothers' inaugural flight in 1903, the good father's dream was realised. While powered by the miracle of the combustion engine, Henry Fabre's later dubbed Fabre Hadriavion found itself skybound from the waters of La Meade Harbour near Marseille on March 10, 1910. Aviation was quickly seized upon by the militaries of the world, and the seaplane was no exception. With 71% of the world's surface covered in water, there was an undeniable logic to the development of seaplanes and their two principal variations. The flying boat was an aircraft whose hull made direct contact with the water, and was closer in conception to Terzi's idea of a sea-based flying machine. The float plane, or pontoon plane, was an aircraft with floats in place of conventional landing gear. Seaplanes underwent their baptism by fire during the Second Balkan War. In one instance, a Greek Astra Hadriavion successfully scouted out the Turkish fleet and dropped 4 bombs before beating a hasty retreat. The fighting in the area escalated during the First World War, as Austro-Hungarian seaplanes were employed to attack and harry Italian ships and ports along the Adriatic coast. The widely used Lerner Model L sported a crew of 2, a 140 horsepower engine, and could carry up to 110 pounds of bombs or 440 pounds of anti-submarine depth charges. Typically armed with a single Schwarz machine gun, a searchlight was also standard, and radio transmitters were carried by some planes. 108 Lerner Ls were built in Austria, yet remarkably 140 were constructed in Italy. These copies, engineered by Macchi, enjoyed a more powerful engine, and the first model was completed in only 34 days. One was even armed with a 23mm cannon for anti-submarine work. It was the Austrian Lerners who would make history, however, with 2 planes sinking the French submarine Foucault on the 15th of September 1916, the first ever air-to-submarine kill. At the end of the war, Italy was left the uncontested master of the Adriatic due to the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Italian Lerner formed the core of the Adriatic Recon and Bombing Force. So was the Italian love of the seaplane established. By the mid-1930s, the seaplane had settled into a narrower role than it enjoyed in the Great War. The development of aircraft carriers and long-range land-based aircraft resulted in a shrinking dependence on military seaplanes for most combatants. Only the British, whose trade was so dependent on holding open the sea lanes, utilised them in what could be considered as a decisive fashion. Certainly, the appearance of a Sunderland flying boat on the horizon caused no end of terror to Germany's U-boat crews, an emergency crash dive being the best hope for survival. The most common role for seaplanes by 1940 was as a reconnaissance and spotter aircraft for naval units. Mounted on catapults, these planes were attached to larger warships and allowed the fleets to which they were attached to range further than the nautical speeds allowed. During the First World War, a short 184 was the only seaplane to participate in a major naval engagement on the 31st of May 1916 at the Battle of Jutland. Despite sighting elements of the German High Seas Fleet and relaying these back to the Royal Navy, they had no impact upon the battle. Their messages never reached the British admirals conducting the action, in keeping with other communication defects which so hampered British performance that day. It did, however, help prove the utility of the seaplane in such a role if it was employed correctly. Under the sponsorship of the fascist government in Rome, the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, underwent expansion and modernisation throughout the 1920s and 1930s, with the intention of challenging French and British dominance in the Mediterranean. This was a tall order given the Italians' numerical disadvantage, and come June 1940, the Regia Marina only had 6 battleships in service. Accurate reconnaissance was therefore critical, for the Italians had to invest their resources carefully and wisely. This often resulted in a shyness to give battle. However, the necessity to know the whereabouts of the enemy was exceptionally important in either engaging or evading them. As of 1932, the sea-based seaplanes of the Regia Marina had declined to a deplorable state, capable of deploying 15 obsolete Macchi M18ARs and 10 Piaggio P6 TERs. Neither design was adequate to the rigours of modern battle, and so a replacement was required. The company OFM, which later became IMAM in July 1936, won the bid to produce this new aircraft. By government request, it was to possess 130 knots maximum speed and have a radius of action equal to or greater than 324 nautical miles, and be capable of reaching 16,400 metres in 26 minutes. Rather than start from scratch, OFM elected to develop a naval version of its Ro43 biplane, which was soon to be adopted by the Army and the Air Force. This was likely a godsend from the point of view of the Navy, whose previous call for a new design had ended in failure. The use of an existing design as a base was therefore efficient and expeditious. First flight tested by Niccolo Lana on the 19th of November 1934, the prototype designated MM24 possessed a 610 horsepower Piaggio P9 engine with a top speed of 162 knots, a radius of 540 nautical miles, and a 3-bladed variable pitch propeller, thus far surpassing the original aircraft requirements. For defence, she was armed with two 7.7mm machine guns. After its acceptance, the engine was replaced with a 700 horsepower Piaggio P10R, and both cockpits were left open, limiting the canopies sported by the prototype, along with added tail reinforcements to bolster the strength of the airframe. Initial production batches were broken down into 3, with a total of 67 machines rolling off the assembly line between June and September 1936. Further machines were produced in groups of 3, until an order in October 1940 for 60 more aircraft. Deliveries began in December 1936 to the 7th Cruiser Division, first to the Condottieri-class light cruiser Museo Attendolo, then her sister ship the Raimondo Montecuccoli the following month. Initial reports were positive regarding the Ro43's performance. However, prolonged usage soon revealed a number of design flaws. The frame was found to be sensitive to the stresses caused by shipborne catapult launches, a problem only compounded by corrosion of the plane's metal components by exposure to seawater. Similarly, the wooden floats were prone to rotting, increasing the overall maintenance time needed to keep any given Ro43 flying. To add insult to injury, the design was even known to overturn upon a water-based landing in fair weather, forcing many Ro43s launched from a ship to return to land for recovery. Under such circumstances, one might wonder why the Regia Marina went on to order more Ro43s given these obvious shortcomings. The answer is a mixture of expediency and necessity. As mentioned, prior attempts to produce a viable seaplane met with failure in the early 1930s, forcing the Navy to continue relying upon outdated models. With Italy engaged in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, the Spanish Civil War, and World War II in a short time frame, being left high and dry again was not an option. The Ro43 allowed for seaplane standardisation across the board, shrinking the spare parts, logistics and training down to a universal design. Also, by 1940, the cost of a single Ro43 had declined from 310 lire to 280,000, a saving increasingly cash-strapped Italy could not afford to ignore. While not perfect, the Ro43 was an effective seaplane when successfully deployed. Nicknamed the Grillo, meaning cricket by sailors, a far better moniker than the Maggiolino or cockchafer favoured by the brass, 44 aircraft were deployed with the Regia Marina onboard ships come the 10th of June 1940. This was out of a 105 aircraft on the books. The two modern Littorio-class battleships, the Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, both had 3 planes aboard, with a further 2 aboard each catapult-equipped cruiser. The Ro43 was used extensively throughout Italy's war, and it is impossible to detail every instance it was set to task. As with the case of the short 184 at Jutland, however, the Italian seaplane found itself involved in a major fleet action in late March 1941 during the Battle of Cape Matapan. Under pressure from their German allies, the Italian Navy put to sea in force with the intent of attacking Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. This was quickly picked up by the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, and unbeknownst to Admiral Aquino, commanding from the Vittorio Veneto, the Royal Navy steamed from Alexandria to force him to battle. Unlike his opponents, Aquino was unaware enemy ships were now abroad and on the hunt. and did not receive his first inklings until a short Sunderland seaplane overflew his ships on the 27th of March. Thus began the age-old process of navies going back thousands of years as the British attempted to locate the Italians, and vice versa, in vast tracts of ocean. On the 28th, an Ro43 from Vittorio Veneto spotted 4 Royal Navy cruisers in advance of the still undetected main British battle group. After shadowing the enemy to the maximum of its range, the seaplane landed at Rhodes 5 hours later, as did the follow-up Ro43 launched from the cruiser Duca degli Abruzzi. The last plane to be launched from the Bolzano later landed at Liro. Matapan was a disaster for the Regia Marina, costing 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and over 3,000 sailors killed or captured. For the Ro43 pilots serving with the fleet, their losses consisted of both aircraft and crews serving with the cruisers Zara and Fiume, MM27055, and MM27129, totaling 8 men in all. The Ro43 had done its duty and alerted the fleet, however was powerless to affect the outcome once battle was unavoidable. If you'd like a detailed breakdown of the Battle of Cape Matapan, I'd recommend Historiograph's excellent video on the subject, which I'll link in the description below. The Ro43 served throughout Italy's war, however by September 1943 their operational strength had dropped to just 18 out of 28 aircraft available. The losses incurred by the Italian fleet to the Allies, combined with an inability to replace losses quickly due to a lacking industrial base and other priorities, bled the Ro43 out of Italy's military machine. Between the 10th of April and 21st of May 1943 alone, casualties were high. In just over a month, both planes aboard the cruiser Trieste went down with their parent vessel during a bombing raid by US liberators, alongside one Ro43 on board the damaged cruiser Gorizia. 9 days later, Allied bombing of La Spezia harbour damaged a further 2 aircraft attached to the Vittorio Veneto. On the 21st of May, the seaplane of the cruiser Eugenio di Savoy was involved in a fatal accident. For the most part, the Ro43's war ended with the September armistice, the majority of their fates remaining unknown. Of 4 planes which made it to Spanish territory, some were pressed into service with the Spanish Air Force until 1951, designated the HR-7 by their new owners. The last surviving example of an Ro43, aircraft MM27050, is preserved at the AMI Historical Museum at Vigna di Valle. The Ro43 was not the only waterborne offspring of the Ro37. In a strange turn which can best be explained by the Italian military's lingering affection for the combat seaplane, the Ro44 was conceived. Unlike its sibling, the 44 was designed for air-to-air warfare, yet its performance was near identical to that of the 43. While it did enjoy an advantage in manoeuvrability thanks to the removal of the secondary cockpit, it was still outpaced by biplanes such as the CR-32, which enjoyed a speed advantage of over 30 knots, despite that plane predating the 44 by 3 years. The development of the 44 was in many ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Italians still maintained a seaplane fighter group, the 88th, equipped with CR-20 floatplanes and matchy M41 Beast flying boats. Once it was decided to keep the 88th on the books, it therefore became necessary to re-equip them in line with the larger seaplane modernisation programme then underway. This process was completed by November 1938, however of the original 51 aircraft intended, only 35 were built. Suffering the same maintenance issues as the Ro43, the 44 was quickly found wanting before it ever made it into combat. On the 1st of March, the 88th disbanded, leaving only the 161st Squadriglia Autumna deploying the 44 in a frontline role, equipped with 9 Ro44s, of which 7 were serviceable. When the war began, the 161st was stationed at Lira Airfield to intercept Allied incursions, only to find itself outpaced by the RAF Wellingtons and Blenheims they were meant to intercept. The 44 suffered no combat losses, yet did see minor action. On the 23rd of November 1940, 3 machines, escorted by a Kantz Z501, strafed Greek vessels in the harbour at Tijami, while on the 14th of March 1941, 4 planes strafed Naxos harbour. In between sporadic combat missions, the 44 engaged in reconnaissance, in particular over the Peloponnesian archipelago, in prelude to the assault on Crete. The last offensive mission was carried out on the 8th of May the same year. A short-lived attempt to utilise the 44 as a day-night fighter came to naught in July of 1931, by which time the 161st had been whittled down to just 4 Ro44s and a single Ro43, most likely through mechanical failure. Scattered Ro44s continued to serve in mixed units and roles until the end of the war, but it never again made a significant contribution to Italy's war effort, if it could said to have done so in the first place. The Ro series was a mixed bag in terms of its success. Certainly, the Ro43 achieved its operational mandate and successfully standardised seaplane design across the Regia Marina. When compared to the hodgepodge of obsolete aircraft the Italians possessed prior to its introduction, it was a marked improvement. However, its various design flaws did not make it an ideal plane with which to go to war. Rather, the Ro43 was a sufficient stopgap that found itself at war. The Ro44, meanwhile, was a fling too far for the Italian military with a now obviously outmoded seaplane fighter. Without the existence of the 88th Gruppo and suggestions for its re-equipment, there never would have been a call for the 44 in the first place. In the 43 and 44, we see two sides to Italian military decision making and procurement. On the one hand, a step forwards and proper, if imperfect, application of Italian design and industrial capacity. On the other, an aircraft entirely built out of bureaucratic necessity and without proper forethought. Which one best typifies Italian war preparation? I'll let you decide.